An old black man in a Marine uniform gently lifted a crying baby from a trash can behind a grocery store alley. The infant, wrapped in nothing but a towel, was cold and alone. But the Marine didn't hesitate. He took off his own jacket and wrapped the baby up, rocking the child gently as if it were his own. He didn't know who the baby belonged to, and he didn't care. What he saw was a life worth saving. Just minutes later, flashing lights painted the alley red and blue. 3. Police officers stormed in, shouting before asking a single question. They saw an old black man in a uniform holding a white baby and jumped to the worst conclusion. "Drop the baby!" one barked, guns drawn. Another cursed at him, grabbing his arm and forcing him to the ground as the baby screamed louder. The Marine didn't resist. He kept whispering to the baby, "You're safe now. You're safe." Even as his cheek hit the pavement and handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The scene caught the attention of a growing crowd nearby. Cameras came out. Angry murmurs filled the air. No one knew who he was, yet. One officer looked at the old man's chest and scoffed. Fake uniform, stolen valor. But another, a younger officer, froze. His eyes locked on the man's name patch and the ribbons on his chest. "Wait, is that General Elijah Monroe?" Silence hit like thunder. The same man they were roughing up had once led hundreds of troops into war zones. He'd earned not only medals, but the respect of nations. He was the kind of man presidents stood up for. The chief arrived moments later, pale as a ghost when he realized who they'd arrested. "Release him, now!" Too late. The damage was done. Reporters had already swarmed the scene, and as the cameras rolled, the general stood up slowly, holding the baby close again. He said nothing at first. Then he looked each officer in the eye and said calmly, "I've buried soldiers younger than all of you, but I never expected to be buried in suspicion on my own soil for saving a life." That line, it silenced the world. The silence that followed the general's words was heavier than the clatter of the cuffs that had just fallen to the ground. The officers didn't know where to look. The baby had stopped crying, as if even it could feel the weight of the moment. General Elijah Monroe stood tall, despite the bruises on his wrist and the mud on his knees. The alley was no longer a hidden place of injustice. It had become a national stage. Someone from the crowd shouted, "Is that really him? The general who rescued his whole unit in Kandahar?" Phones were raised higher. Voices were murmuring. His name now. Monroe didn't flinch. He didn't need to explain himself. The medals sewn into his jacket told stories no words ever could. Stories of sacrifice, courage, and loyalty. The police chief stammered an apology. "Sir, General Monroe, we didn't recognize—" "You weren't supposed to recognize me," the general interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "You were supposed to recognize a human being trying to help a child." He looked at the young officer who had spoken his name correctly, the only one who hadn't drawn a weapon. "What's your name, son?" "Officer Daniels, sir." "You still have a chance to be the kind of officer this country needs," Monroe said. "Don't let fear or hate speak louder than truth." A black SUV pulled up then, and several men in dark suits stepped out, military aides, former security staff, and his personal assistant, all of whom had been alerted by the news breaking live across social media. A dignified woman with gray streaks in her braided hair stepped out next, carrying a hospital blanket and a bottle of baby formula. She nodded to the general. "Sir, the baby will be taken care of. The VA pediatric shelter is prepped and waiting." He gently passed the baby to her. "Make sure she grows up safe and free." As Monroe turned to walk away, the officers stepped back in silent shame. He didn't glare. He didn't scold. He just walked, shoulders back, steps firm. The same way he used to march through battlefields. By morning, the footage had gone viral. General Monroe trended worldwide. "Arrested for compassion" became the headline on every major network. and the police department issued a national apology. Later that week, in front of a packed press room in Washington, a statement was issued by the Pentagon. General Elijah Monroe, retired, is not only one of the most decorated officers in Marine Corps history, but a living example of the values we claim to stand for: honor, integrity, and service to others. He was offered a full public ceremony of apology. He declined. He didn't want parades, he wanted reform. And as he stood before Congress just days later, holding up a photo of the baby he saved, he said, "It shouldn't take medals for a black man to be believed when he's doing good. It shouldn't take rank for my brothers and sisters to be treated with dignity. I didn't save that child for applause. I did it because that's what America's supposed to be." The room stood, and so did a country that for a moment remembered its soul. The general didn't ask for justice that night. He embodied it. As he walked away from the alley, the sun broke through the skyline, casting long shadows on the city street. Cars slowed. Passers-by stared. Some clapped without even knowing why. There was something magnetic about his calm, his strength, the unshakable sense that even after everything, he was still leading. Not troops now, but a nation aching for reminders of what decency looks like. Behind him, the officers stood frozen. The youngest, Officer Daniels, removed his hat, holding it to his chest. His hands trembled. The other two, red-faced and stunned, watched as the crowd around them grew louder, not with anger, but with disappointment. Phones were still rolling, but now every lens turned from outrage to reverence for the man who never lost his composure. By the time General Monroe reached the end of the block, a black limousine waited. The door opened, and a man in a tailored suit saluted him, not because he had to, but because respect demanded it. The general paused before getting in. He turned around slowly and looked once more toward the alley where it all began. He didn't speak, but his gaze said enough. That alley was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a symbol of how quickly perception turns to prejudice, and how even in the darkest corners, light could still break through. Inside the limo, his assistant handed him a file. "Sir," she said, "we've already received 30,000 letters of support. 3. Congressional leaders want to meet. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. They all want your voice." He set the file aside and looked out the window. "Let them talk," he said softly. "I've said what I needed to say. Now let them listen." Later that night, the baby girl was admitted into the safest care unit in the state. Monroe made one quiet visit before dawn. He didn't speak to the press, didn't announce himself. He simply sat beside her crib and whispered, "I don't know your name, but I know your future matters. You're not forgotten. Not now. Not ever." He left a single item behind on the hospital table, his Purple Heart. When the nurse found it later, she gasped and cried. That medal stayed in the child's file, a reminder of how her life began, not in tragedy, but in the arms of someone who saw her as precious, and the old Marine. He went back to his simple home in the country. No press. No interviews. But every month, quietly, he donated part of his pension to a fund he started that day, the Forgotten Cradle Project, an initiative to care for abandoned children, especially those born into poverty and prejudice. He didn't need recognition. He already had a nation's heart. Months passed. The headlines faded. The media moved on. But the story of General Elijah Monroe only grew in silence. In the quiet corners of America, people still whispered his name, not as a celebrity, not even as a hero, but as a standard. A reminder of what it meant to be more when the world expected less. His country home sat nestled between two rolling hills in Georgia. A modest wooden porch, a rocking chair that creaked with the wind, and an old Marine Corps flag gently swaying beside the door. He lived alone, but he was never truly alone. Letters poured in daily. Some were from mothers, some from veterans, some from children, scribbled in crayon. Thank you for being kind. I want to be like you when I grow up. You saved her like a superhero. He read every one, then filed them in a box he labeled Hope. Every Sunday he returned to the hospital where the little girl had been placed in care. She had since been adopted by a loving couple, a nurse and her husband, both of whom had watched the footage the day it happened. They didn't just see a baby, they saw a mission. They named her Grace. Each time he visited, he brought her a book. He'd sit nearby as her adoptive parents played with her in the garden. And when she was old enough, he planned to tell her the full truth, not of abandonment, but of rescue. Not of shame, but of the miracle that unfolded because she had been born into a moment that would change countless lives. Back in Washington, his actions were still rippling. The Monroe Act passed in Congress, a federal law that required officers to complete de-escalation training when responding to vulnerable community calls. His name was carved into the record, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. At a veterans gathering in Arlington, his photo was unveiled, life-sized beside a plaque that read, "He served his country not just with courage in war, but with compassion in peace." When no one else saw value in a life discarded, he did. And he didn't just carry her, he carried us all. Still, Monroe didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, he spent that day under the shade of an oak tree near his house, whittling. A small wooden toy with his weathered hands. It was a cradle, no larger than his palm. When finished, he placed it beside a photo of Grace, smiling, safe, growing. He whispered, "That's all I ever wanted." In the years that followed, thousands of children would be saved through the Forgotten Cradle Project. But no one knew that each toy cradle sent with the children came from one place. Monroe's own hands, one at a time, quietly, faithfully. He never asked the world to remember him, but it always would. Years continued to roll by, seasons painting the landscape around Monroe's small home with the brush strokes of time, crimson autumns, silver winters, golden springs. But inside that humble house, everything remained the same. A wall lined with military awards no longer shined with pride, but with memory. His uniform, once crisp with iron discipline, now rested behind glass, folded and reverent, beside a framed photograph of Grace in her graduation gown. Yes, Grace had grown up. Guided by love, fueled by the story that birthed her legacy. Grace had become more than a survivor. She became a voice for children like her. She didn't just attend college, she led her class. She didn't just speak at youth conferences, she lit fires in hearts. Every time she took the stage, she carried his spirit. She never called him stranger, she called him Grandpa. He never asked for that, but she gave it anyway. Every year, on the day they first met, the day he found her in the trash can, she visited his porch and brought him a pie. It became their sacred tradition. She'd say, "You gave me life. Least I can do is give you something sweet." And he'd always reply, "You were the sweetness, Grace. I just carried you home." One late summer afternoon, with the porch bathed in honey gold light, she visited again, this time with a young boy by her side. Her son. She knelt beside the rocking chair and whispered, "Grandpa, I named him Elijah." The old Marine's eyes misted. His voice cracked. "Why?" Grace smiled, eyes shining. "Because you didn't just save a life. You started a legacy." He took the boy in his arms, held him close. For a moment, time folded in on itself like pages of a book closing gently after the final line. The baby he once held in fear and defiance had grown into a woman of power and grace. And now, her child would grow up knowing the story, not of violence, not of rage, but of compassion in the face of chaos. Later that night, Monroe sat alone again under the oak tree. A soft breeze stirred the wind chimes above his porch, Crickets sang their summer chorus. He leaned back in his chair, looked at the stars breaking through the sky, and whispered to the wind, "Mission complete." That would be his final evening. He passed in his sleep, peacefully, hands still resting on the cradle he'd carved that day. His funeral drew thousands. Veterans, children, presidents, civilians. Grace stood tall, holding baby Elijah, and read, aloud his last letter, written in shaky pen. "I was never the hero. I just answered when I heard a cry. If my life meant anything, let it be this. Listen to the cries others ignore. Lift them up. Carry them, even when the world tells you not." 2. Because kindness is the real rank. The nation mourned, but Grace, she lived. She carried his story like a banner in battle, starting the Elijah Monroe Institute, dedicated to training young leaders in justice, ethics, and heart-first service, and on the front gate, etched in black, "Stone." One man heard a cry. He didn't walk away, neither will we. And so, the story of General Elijah Monroe does not end with his last breath, but begins anew with every act of courage, every moment of grace, and every child lifted from the shadows into the light. He taught a nation that true strength lies, not in medals or uniforms, but in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. He wasn't just a Marine. He wasn't just a general. He was the man who stopped to listen when a baby cried, the man who rose when the world pushed him down, the man who proved that one quiet act of kindness can echo across generations. Elijah Monroe didn't need a monument. He became one, and every cradle carved, every life saved, every heart opened in his name, is a legacy no one can erase. He didn't ask to be remembered. He just refused to let us forget.